Okay, so what we're going to do to make sure we're getting the right angle or actually hitting the very edge of the knife, because what can happen is when you sharpen the knife, you can actually get at an angle where we don't actually hit the edge of the knife. So we're going to sit there, and when we're sharpening over here and we're doing all this work, but we're not actually getting to the edge. So what we want to do is keep sharpening until we get to the edge. Now the easiest way to do that is to mark the blade of the knife. So we can sit there and I can run this marker all the way down the edge here and make sure that we're actually hitting the edge. So I can sit there. Now I know we will because we're at actually a little too steep of an angle. And we want to start at a real shallow angle and work our way down to make sure we're getting to the actual point. So we want to you can kind of do some test angles until you get to that point. So we're going to do that 22 degree here, and we're going to sit there and cut it. And what I can see, and it's really hard to see here, I don't know if you guys can see that at home, but I basically removed my pen. So I've removed my pen at the very tip and allowed me to where all the blue is gone. So I know I'm getting all the way to the tip. Now once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and sharpen it all the way through until I've removed it all. Now once I've done that and I've gone all the way down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill for what we call a burr on the other side of the knife. Once I've got a burr, and actually you'll fill it with your fingernail, or sometimes you can fill, like on this knife I can actually fill it with my finger here, but I can fill it with my fingernail, and I want to fill that burr all the way down. And if I fill on the other side, there's no burr. And that means that I've actually got all the way to the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the knife over. I can go ahead and work the other side. And I can see whether I got to that point where I've got my burr all the way down on the other side. And at that point, that tells me that I can move to the next stone. So I can go ahead, and we're going to kind of cut through stones pretty fast here. We're going to kind of skip to the end here. What we're going to go ahead and do is now I can sit there and check it, and we're going really fast, so at home you're going to do quite a few more strokes. You have to do more strokes as you get finer and finer. And we're going to make sure we're hitting to where we're actually getting it cut on both sides. Okay. I usually flip it twice. Doesn't have to be, but I'll flip it. So I've done both sides twice. Okay. Once I've done that, and like I said, we're skipping through pretty fast. We're getting up into our high-end stones here. And I do recommend that you wipe the blade in between stones, because as you get up into your polishing stones, you won't want that grit from the other ones on there. So this happens to be a 1,000 grit stone, and keep in mind I do about 10 different steps, so we're jumping quite a few steps here. This is more for showing you online. So once we're going to do that, we're going to go these big long strokes, as big as we can make. Excuse me. And this is more of a polishing type. Once we've polished it, we'll flip it over and do the other side. Now once we've polished it and we've gone through all of our different stones up to what I consider stopping at, I consider stopping about 2,000 grit. And that would be our sapphire stone here that polishes up. That's what Lansky has as their high-end stone, which is 2,000 grit. Some systems out there get much more in depth than that. I don't think there's any reason to get that much more than 2,000 grit. It seems to work very, very well. We go ahead and we take it out of our tool here. So we separate it from our tool. Then at this point, what I'm going to go ahead and do is what we call stropping. Now stropping can be done on a couple different things. You can use newspaper or you can use leather. I like leather because it's a little easier to keep your hands on. And what we're going to do, we're never going to cut into the blade, we're going to cut away. So we're going to pull backwards. And I'm actually going to pull each way every single time. I do this about 10 times. That's pulling the burr, what they call that burr that we were talking about. That burr that we were talking about, which is, you know, where we're going to have the problem with it actually rolling over. Well, it also comes out in fibers. So you'll actually see it get kind of hairy. And you'll see the hair come off there like that. That's actually what's going to sharpen. So you'll see that fiber, if we were to look at it under the microscope, it'd look almost like just little hairs sticking up. Now what we don't want is to leave it like that. And a lot of people do. They leave it all stropped, and this is where you get to the point of where you'll see the barber used to strop. This is to get the knife razor sharp. The problem is it doesn't stay sharp. So after I've done that about 10 times on one side, I'll come over to the smooth side of the leather. And this is just a regular old piece of leather. This isn't anything fancy. I'm going to go ahead and do that where I can come through. And this knife at this point is very sharp. To the point of where, you know, we can sit here and we can cut paper with it all day long. You know, just stropping it just a little bit. The problem is that if we end up doing anything with the blade, it tends to get to a point of where it will actually have a problem with every time you go to use it, it dulls out. Like if you're going to shave with it, it would dull out to where it would become dull very quickly. So what we want to do is we want to sit there and make a knife that's going to be able to cut, you know, as we hear the dogs run through the house. You know, so we want a knife that's going to cut over and over and over again. So what we do to solve that problem is something they've been doing in Japan for years, is what we call micro beveling. That basically means we have a primary edge, which is the actual thickness of the blade. We have a secondary edge, which is the actual edge all the way to the tip. And to get rid of that very last little part, we do a micro bevel. So let's say this happens to be 20 degrees. I'm going to put a micro bevel on, still at that 2000 grit. We're going to go ahead and use the 2000 grit stones again, and we're going to use it at 21 degrees. Now I did this one, we did it about 19 degrees when we actually put it on our stones so we could finish with a 20 degree. And this particular device, this happens to be a Spyderco Sharpener that works really well, but it holds it in line. You can change your angles based on moving your knife back and forth, but this particular one works just fine. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run through and hone the knife the last little bit with a micro bevel. You can't even hardly see it unless you're looking very close, but there's one last little bevel on the very edge of the knife. So once you've done that, the knife at that point is going to stay sharp a much longer time. Now what I do recommend is that you kind of keep an eye on what angle you're using for what kind of item you're trying to sharpen. Like I said, I wouldn't put a 20-degree knife on an axe because it would dull out almost immediately. With a knife that is high quality steel, and you'll see this a lot in German knives versus Japanese knives. Japanese use a very sharp, really hard steel. So they put a lot of their knives will be 15 to 16 degrees. When we've got knives that are German, they want a little bit of a stronger edge because they're going to cut a lot more meat and things like that. And you're going to see a knife that is going to be cut at the 20-degree mark. So it's 20 degrees on both sides, or 22.5 degrees a lot of times is what they'll tell you. So you need to make the knife as sharp as you can make it for what you're trying to do with it. If I was going to use it once, a razor sharp knife is great, but overall most people are going to use their knives a lot. They're going to hit trees, things like that. If I'm shaving with it, a super razor sharp knife is great, but it's not going to stay sharp. So just kind of think about, try to usually, until you understand angles a little more, and it's going to take practice just to learn where that angle is and what that knife is best for. We're going to go ahead and use that standard of, you know, trying to keep that 22-degree mark. Seems to cut very well for most of your knives in your home. unless you know or you're able to contact the manufacturer and say, okay, what angle is on this knife, they'll usually be able to tell you what angle was on it originally. So think in those terms. So once we've done all that, we can go ahead and micro bevel the knife, and the knife becomes excruciatingly sharp at that point. You're getting to a point, and we haven't done any real work to this knife, but we're looking for it to go ahead and cut all the way through, which paper is fairly easy to cut. We want it to cut, this is usually, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about what is sharp per se. We want the knives to be able to catch and cut magazine paper. So, and when you bend over magazine paper, it becomes very hard to cut magazine paper because it's smooth. So it tends to be harder to cut than other items. So we want to be able to have it catch and cut that item. So we'll catch and slide all the way through just with pushing. Not pulling, but pushing. So we call push cutting. Now, is this knife razor sharp at this point? No. We haven't had a chance. It usually takes about an hour to do each knife that we do. But we're just trying to give you some of the basics of knife sharpening. I do recommend getting the Lansky systems. You can get them on eBay for right around 35 bucks. Comes with a setup similar to this, which will have all your rods and everything in there. You'll have to set up the rods. There's tons of videos out there on how to do them. But I like them like this. This is the way I leave them. I leave them already pre-done, and then I just cut out the plastic on both sides so I can go ahead and close the lids so they stay closed. And that way I'm not having to put the bars on every single time. This C-clamp is well worth its weight in gold. They also make this same system in a little plastic guy that allows you just to put them on there. You don't technically even need them to do that, but it is, you can sharpen it just in your hand. I tend to think being able to put some pressure on there is a good idea. When you're sharpening, you want to be able to put about 4 to 6 pounds of pressure on the actual blade while you're doing it. So that's why I like this system, because it allows me to be able to put plenty of pressure on there. Kind of the last thing, sharpening serrated knives. Serrated knives, usually we're sharpening the tips. So Lansky makes a system for that allows you to go and you're actually able to work at the same angle and work your way down all the way through. So you can sharpen the insides. And then when it comes to the points, when you're sharpening the actual points themselves, I actually like this tool right here. This is the Lansky Sharpener. I don't know why, I just seem to like Lansky, I guess. I have a lot of their sharpener type systems. They tend to be very reasonable for the price you actually pay. And it has a bunch of different angles and allows you to be able to get into the angle that best matches your knife. And I actually work back and forth at different angles until I'm sharpening the very tips, which is usually what gets dull on a serrated knife. Now, since it's only sharpened on one side, once I sharpen it, I have to come to the back side with a flat angle and actually just finish it off. So I'm actually going to put the blade almost dead flat at a 0-degree angle until I can get it in just right along that back side. Now I'll usually sharpen about 10 times for every one time I do the other side. So just kind of something to think about. These are $5-6 also. Do I need all this stuff? No, you don't need all this stuff. A simple $15 sharpener will get you to a point of where you can cut paper, and it allows you to be able to try that. But if you're really into knives, and most of us backpacking people love knives, so getting into where we can really make a knife super, super razor sharp, that's something to think about. Again, I do not recommend going over 2000 grit. I don't think there's any real purpose. It's going to make it polish a lot nicer, so the blade actually looks really nice and shiny. And you'll be able to see that. Something to think about. But it doesn't really give you an advantage. One last trick is how to feel whether the blade is sharp. And to me, you'll see a lot of guys that will do this. They actually put their hand on there and they'll push and see if the blade's sharp all the way down. I tend not to like that. And I don't like the, I used to stroke the blade across here and you could feel where the real sharp sections were when you pulled your hand across. Again, I don't like that because we're dealing with scouts, smaller kids. We don't want them sitting there stroking their hands across the blade to get themselves cut. We don't want that. So what I use is I use the light method. I actually hold the blade within the light coming onto the blade, and I will see nicks in the blade as they show up. And you'll have to try this at home. If you've got a cheap knife that is fairly sharp, you won't see anything. Take it on the ground and you'll actually push it on to, let's say, a piece of concrete where you know you're going to ding the blade up a little bit. Once you do that, when you pull it back up, you'll see little shiny spots where every single spot of dull is, where it's actually crushed the blade, either rounded it off to where we could pull the blade back out with a honing steel, or where we'd actually have to resharpen the blade completely. Now, if we see that all the way down, that's a blade that needs to be sharpened all the way down. So that thumbnail trick, and that is usually what I use. Now you can use, for the thumbnail trick, you can use a piece of plastic. You want it to catch on that piece of plastic all the way down. If you're getting it like this and it's just carving off and you're not able to get any decent of an angle, not sharp. As soon as you hit it and it's able to stick, you've got at least a edge that has come all the way together. And then giving the company a call and saying, hey, look, what angle should I make this at? So I hope this video was helpful. If you have questions, feel free to leave them at the bottom. If you like our videos, like them. That's how we know whether you guys actually want to see videos like this. Now, if you're part of the, if you guys are part of the scouting program and have questions or would like to see a different video, put it at the bottom. Put it in a comment. I try to hit those for the first little bit, at least the first 6 months or so, and keep an eye on those to make sure I'm answering your questions. If I'm not, hit me up. Make sure I'm answering those questions for you guys. But this is Black Bear Prepper. Have a great day.